Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the death of Monica Quartermain did not simply mark the passing of a matriarch who had long been the emotional anchor of her family. It opened a shadowed doorway into secrets that had been carefully concealed for decades. What should have been a time of grief, mourning, and solemn reflection quickly turned into the beginning of something darker, a quiet storm forming beneath the surface of Port Charles society. While Jason, Tracy, and the rest of the Quartermain family busied themselves with the painful logistics of planning a funeral, one man held knowledge that none of them could have anticipated. Martin Gray, a man already infamous for his backroom dealings and calculated manipulation of the law, had discovered a letter that threatened to upend everything the Quartermains thought they knew about themselves. The letter, innocuous in appearance and nearly discarded as a child's scrap, had been destined for Monica. Its author was no stranger but rather the long-lost sister whom Monica had not spoken to in years, perhaps decades. No one else in the Quartermain estate realized its existence, but Martin had intercepted it, studied its contents with careful calculation, and chosen to keep his discovery hidden. In the privacy of his office, behind drawn curtains, Martin pieced together a strategy that only someone with his brand of ruthlessness could devise. He understood immediately that the return of Monica's sister could act as a catalyst, a force powerful enough to disrupt the Quartermain family's fragile balance of loyalty and resentment. Martin's motivations were never purely altruistic. Recently freed from the burden of Stella Henry's legal troubles after a discreet agreement with Drew Kane, he no longer needed to divide his attention between multiple fronts. With Stella safe, Martin was free to sharpen his focus entirely on the prize that now loomed before him. The Quartermains, wealthy, fractured, and vulnerable, had long been ripe for exploitation, and Monica's death only intensified those vulnerabilities. The letter gave Martin leverage, and the prospect of the sister's arrival offered him the opportunity to use that leverage in ways that could change the Quartermain legacy forever. His mind immediately turned to Tracy Quartermain, a woman who had built her life on control, authority, and the ability to outmaneuver even her closest relatives. Tracy had many sins tucked neatly behind the gilded walls of his estate, sins that Martin suspected could be dragged into the light. He envisioned a scenario where Monica's sister became the unwitting weapon in his hands, a voice of legitimacy who could reopen old wounds, call into question past financial dealings, and even challenge Tracy's place within the family hierarchy. For Martin, the plan was not simply about revenge, it was about opportunity. With Tracy weakened, he could insert himself into the fold as a trusted advisor, perhaps even a savior, while quietly arranging circumstances that would allow him to profit both financially and politically. The timing could not have been more perfect. Monica's funeral promised to gather together an array of old faces, loyal family members, estranged relatives, and those who had long harbored grudges but never dared to speak them aloud. Martin knew such gatherings were volatile. Grief often blurred judgment, loosened tongues, and reopened fractures long thought sealed. Into that emotional chaos, the sudden reemergence of Monica's sister would be a lightning strike. Grief-stricken relatives would not question her presence, at least not immediately. They would welcome her, albeit with shock, and as they scrambled to make sense of her return, Martin would quietly position himself as the man who made the reunion possible. What no one else understood was that Martin had already reached out, already made the first move. The mysterious call he placed, under the guise of compassion, had informed Monica's sister of her sibling's death, urging her to come not only to bid farewell but to make her voice heard in the matters of inheritance and legacy. Martin's words had been carefully chosen, painting Tracy in shadows, suggesting that the family estate might slip into hands unworthy of Monica's memory if her sister remained silent. It was an invitation disguised as duty, and Martin anticipated that the woman's grief would make her pliable to his narrative. For Martin, this was a game of patience and precision. He was not a man of brute force but of subtle manipulation, and in this case, the tools at his disposal were grief, guilt, and greed. He knew Tracy well enough to understand that her pride would not allow her to step aside gracefully if her authority was challenged. She would fight, she would lash out, and in doing so she would expose herself. Martin's task was merely to fan the flames, to ensure that every sharp word and defensive move Tracy made only deepened her isolation. As the Quartermains prepared for Monica's farewell, Martin prepared for something entirely different. a theater of chaos in which he would be both playwright and actor. He saw himself weaving between mourners, whispering reassurances here, planting doubts there, never fully revealing his role in orchestrating the storm. He envisioned the moment Monica's sister would rise to speak, her presence alone casting a long shadow over Tracy. He anticipated Tracy's fury, her attempts to dismiss or discredit, and he relished the inevitability that her rage would betray her secrets. The death of Monica should have been an ending, a quiet closure to a long and storied chapter of the Quartermain dynasty. Instead, it became the opening act of Martin's most ambitious scheme yet. He did not merely want to see Tracy fall, he wanted to reshape the future of the Quartermain estate with his own hand guiding the pieces. Every look, every whispered conversation, every veiled accusation at the funeral would serve as another thread in the web he spun. And as grief gave way to suspicion, and suspicion to open conflict, Martin Gray would be there in the shadows, patient and calculating, waiting for the moment when the entire Quartermain family realized that the true danger was not in their shared loss but in the man who had turned that loss into his weapon. The funeral of Monica Quartermain had been intended as a moment of solemn remembrance, a gathering of family, friends, and colleagues who would pay their respects to a woman whose presence had shaped not only the Quartermain household but also the broader community of Port Charles. Yet beneath the surface of grief, something else stirred, a convergence of resentments, secrets, and ambitions that would transform the event from a tribute into a battlefield. The Quartermains had long carried with them the burden of internal strife, their legacy of wealth matched only by their capacity for self-destructs. Monica's death, rather than soothing those tensions, had exposed them, dragging everyone into a drama that unfolded beneath the chandeliers of the estate like a carefully written play. The early hours of the funeral saw mourners arriving in waves, each carrying not only sorrow but also their own histories with Monica and with each other. Jason moved with quiet dignity, his posture rigid as though the weight of both family obligation and personal grief pressed heavily against his shoulders. He was to deliver the eulogy, a responsibility that seemed almost inevitable, given his role as Monica's steadfast son, but even his presence could not calm the undercurrent of unease. Jason embodied loyalty and resilience, but he also symbolized a fracture point. This loyalty to Monica contrasted with the ambivalence many others in the family had felt toward her at different times. His words, no matter how sincere, could not conceal the reality that the Quartermains were a family perpetually at war with themselves. Tracy, as always, made her presence known with the cold sharpness of her demeanor. To the outside world she appeared unshaken, her eyes focused and her expression unreadable. But beneath the mask was fear. Tracy had built a life on control, on maneuvering herself into positions of power no matter the cost. But Monica's death created vulnerabilities she could not deny. Tracy understood the power vacuum that now existed, and though she longed to fill it, she also recognized the risk that old shadows might emerge to challenge her authority. In the hushed murmurs of the gathered family, Tracy could hear the whisper of accusations unspoken, the suggestion that she, more than anyone else, had reasons to fear what Monica had left behind. Into this already fragile environment came the shock of Monica's long-lost sister. Her appearance was unexpected, her voice tremulous with grief yet tinged with the certainty of someone who believed she had rights long denied. Her very presence was an act of disruption, shaking the balance of the ceremony before she even spoke of inheritance or family ties. For the mourners, it was as though a ghost had stepped into the room, forcing them to reconcile with a history they had been content to forget. For Tracy, it was a nightmare made flesh. Every glance in her direction, every whispered exchange, seemed to accuse her of something not yet revealed but deeply suspected. The sister's grief was real, but so too was her determination to be recognized, and it was this determination that would soon transform Monica's funeral into a tribunal. Martin Gray, from the sidelines, observed with a satisfaction he carefully concealed. His involvement was invisible to most, but he knew better than anyone that this was no coincidence. He had orchestrated the sisters' arrival, pulling strings with the precision of a man accustomed to backroom deals and whispered bargains. For Martin, this was more than grief, it was an opportunity born from tragedy. Years of financial collapse, of humiliation and desperation, had left him hungry. He had learned to see in every moment of weakness the possibility of gain, and the Quartermain funeral was, to him, a goldmine of vulnerability. The letter he had intercepted, written in a hand filled with regret and longing, was his weapon, and through it he had summoned a storm that no one else saw coming. Martin's calculations extended beyond vengeance. He had no desire merely to see Tracy suffer, though that was a benefit. What he sought was influence, money, and power. By casting Monica's sister into the midst of the funeral, he created a wedge that could be driven deeper with each passing moment. Tracy's outbursts, inevitable given her nature, would paint her as unstable, controlling, even tyrannical. The sister's claims, even if exaggerated, would carry the weight of legitimacy simply because of her bloodline. And Martin, quietly guiding events, would position himself as the confidant, the advisor, the man who could entangle the chaos for those willing to trust him. Drew Kane, unaware of how tightly the threads were wrapping around him, became another piece on Martin's board. His uneasy truce with Martin, secured through the protection of Stella Henry, had left him believing he was free of entanglement. But Martin had never intended to let him go. Drew's resentment toward Tracy, his volatile place within the family structure, made him the perfect instrument for manipulation. Every time Drew cast a hostile glance in Tracy's direction, every time his voice rose in opposition, Martin saw an opportunity to deepen the divide. Drew might believe he acted from principle, from his own sense of justice, but in truth, he was marching to a rhythm Martin had already set. The funeral service itself soon became an arena. Jason's eulogy, heartfelt and steady, spoke of Monica's compassion, her resilience, her unwavering presence in the lives of her children and grandchildren. But even as his voice echoed through the hall, eyes shifted restlessly toward Monica's sister, who sat poised yet uneasy, her grief manifesting not only in tears but also in the simmering desire to be heard. Whispers spread. Who was she? Why had she never been seen before? And what did her sudden arrival mean for the estate? Each word Jason spoke was followed not by silence but by murmurs of speculation, as though Monica's memory itself was being overshadowed by the drama of her sister's presence. When the sister finally rose to speak, the atmosphere cracked. Her words began with sorrow, recalling memories of a childhood cut short by distance and estrangement, but soon shifted into a declaration. She was family, she was blood, and she would not be overlooked. The mourners shifted uneasily, their grief disrupted by the sting of confrontation. Tracy, unable to contain herself, responded with barely veiled hostility. Her voice, sharp and dismissive, attempted to reduce the sister's claims to irrelevance, but in her anger she betrayed more than she concealed. The more she fought, the more she seemed to confirm the very accusations whispered against her that she had long sought to erase inconvenient truths. Martin did not intervene. He did not need to. Each word spoken by Tracy, each glance exchanged among the family, tight in the web he had spun. The funeral, far from silencing conflict, had magnified it, transforming the Quartermain estate into a crucible where old wounds and new rivalries blended into something volatile. For Martin, the game was progressing exactly as planned. He had unleashed chaos, and in that chaos he would thrive. By the time the final prayers were spoken, the ceremony had shifted irrevocably. Monica's life had been honored, but her death had become the spark of a new war. Jason, torn between loyalty to his family and the need to preserve order, struggled to hold the pieces together. Drew, increasingly pulled into Martin's orbit, could not yet see the full extent of his manipulation. Tracy, shaken and furious, found herself exposed, her authority challenged in ways she could not easily dismiss. And Monica's sister, once estranged and forgotten, now stood as both a symbol of unresolved history and a claimant to the future. As the mourners dispersed into the corridors of the Quartermain estate, the weight of what had transpired hung in there like smoke after a fire. Monica's funeral had not been a conclusion but a beginning, the opening move in a struggle that would redefine the Quartermain legacy. And in the shadows, Martin Gray waited, patient and calculating, knowing that his role as architect of this chaos had only just begun. The clash between Tracy Quartermain and Martin Gray was no longer a possibility, was an inevitability. A collision that would shake the foundation of the Quartermain family and spill far beyond the walls of their estate. Tracy had always thrived in conflict, priding herself on her ability to bend others to her will, to crush opposition with a sharp tongue or a strategic maneuver. Yet this time the storm brewing against her was unlike anything she had encountered before, for it was not born of a single rival's ambition but from a web of manipulation, secrecy, and grief woven together by Martin Gray. He had entered the Quartermain world quietly, a man broken by financial ruin and failure, but now he stood poised to remake himself in the chaos of their loss, and Tracy was his chosen target. Martin's possession of Monica's sister's letter gave him an edge sharper than any legal tactic. It was more than a message from the past. It was a doorway into long-buried truths, an artifact of Monica's hidden history that no one had anticipated. The revelation that Monica's sister still lived and carried claims to both recognition and inheritance transformed the balance of power overnight. Martin, cunning as ever, understood the weight of that truth. By securing the sisters' trust, he did not merely introduce a new voice into the Quartermain circle, he introduced a force of destabilization that Tracy could neither predict nor control. Every time the sister spoke, every demand she raised, it threatened to chip away at Tracy's authority and unravel the empire she had guarded for decades. Tracy's instincts told her to confront the challenge head-on, to meet fire with fire as she had always done. But this was different. The sisters' words were wrapped in the legitimacy of bloodline and grief, and Martin's orchestration ensured that every objection Tracy raised sounded cold, selfish, and cruel. Where once her sharpness had been her strength, it now became her greatest liability. Relatives who might otherwise have stood by her found themselves wavering, and willing to appear unsympathetic in the wake of Monica's death. The sisters' mere presence forced them to choose, and in those quiet moments of indecision, Martin inserted himself as the calm, rational voice of reason, one who could guide the family through uncertainty. It was a mask he wore well, and Tracy's rage only made it more convincing. Drew, caught between resentment toward Tracy and unease toward Martin, became a critical piece in this dangerous puzzle. His earlier agreement with Martin to protect Stella Henry had seemed like a resolution, but it was in fact a leash. Martin tugged on it skillfully, ensuring that Drew remained entangled in his schemes without fully realizing it. The more Drew saw distance from Tracy, the closer he drifted into Martin's sphere of influence. And Drew, with his standing as both a Quartermain and a Kane, carried weight in the family that Martin could exploit. Through him, Martin found yet another channel to undermine Tracy's position. Each conversation between Drew and Tracy became more hostile, each dispute another crack in the already fractured family. The Quartermain estate itself became a symbol of the struggle, grand, imposing, but trembling beneath the weight of division. Rooms once filled with Monica's warmth now echoed with whispered strategy sessions, accusations, and veiled threats. Jason tried to hold the family together, but even his presence could not suppress the growing storm. He delivered Monica's eulogy with grace, but while mourners wept at his words, Martin calculated the impact of every reaction, every subtle glance. He was less interested in the grief of the moment, and more concerned with how it could be transformed into leverage for tomorrow. Tracy soon found herself surrounded, not by outright enemies but by family members who no longer trusted her judgment. The sister questioned her motives at every turn, Martin whispered doubts into sympathetic ears, and Drew openly challenged her authority. For years she had stood as the guardian of the Quartermain legacy, but now her defenses were collapsing under the weight of relentless scrutiny. Each day brought new confrontations, new reminders of choices she had made that could no longer be hidden. Old financial disputes resurfaced, long-forgotten betrayals were resurrected, and even her allies began to wonder whether Monica's sister had a rightful claim to more than just words at a funeral. For Martin, this was victory unfolding exactly as planned. He knew Tracy's pride would not allow her to retreat, and in her stubborn defiance, she exposed herself further. Her anger became ammunition, her bitterness a spectacle. He never needed to attack her directly. All he had to do was set the stage and allow her to destroy herself piece by piece. And as the family fractured, Martin positioned himself as the one figure capable of navigating the chaos. Each conflict reinforced his role as the quiet manipulator, the man with the solutions, the man who could turn grief into strategy and uncertainty into opportunity. Port Charles itself began to feel the tremors of this conflict. The Quartermains were more than just a family, they were an institution, and their turmoil sent ripples through the community. Business partners grew nervous, allies began to hedge their bets, and whispers of scandal spread across town. Monica's death, instead of solidifying the family's unity, became the catalyst for its unraveling. Neighbors and rivals alike watched eagerly, knowing that when the mighty fall, opportunities emerge for everyone else. The question that lingered over all of this was not simply whether Tracy would lose her grip on power, but how far Martin was willing to go to ensure her downfall. His hunger for influence, sharpened by years of failure, was insatiable. He had already proven he was willing to manipulate grief, exploit trust, and weaponize secrets. What else lay within his reach? Would he stop at dismantling Tracy's authority, or would he seize the Quartermain fortune outright, twisting the family into an empire that answered only to him? The tragedy of Monica's passing was that it did not end with Harriet open the door to a far darker saga. The Quartermains, instead of standing united, were now pawns in a larger game orchestrated by a man they barely understood. Tracy, for all her experience and strength, found herself forced onto the defensive, her empire crumbling beneath her feet. And as Martin pressed forward, his shadow stretched longer across the family, leaving only uncertainty and fear in its wake. In the end, Port Charles would not remember Monica's funeral for the eulogies spoken or the tears shed. It would remember it as the moment the Quartermains began to devour themselves from within, the moment when grief was transformed into warfare. The only certainty was that Martin Gray, once dismissed as a desperate schemer, had emerged as the architect of their chaos. And as each secret surfaced and each alliance shifted, the looming question grew heavier: who would fall next, and who, if anyone, could stop him before the entire Quartermain legacy was consumed by his ambition?